What do you think investors are evaluating in the early stages in this market?
Tends to be sort of an if you know kind of situation that happens.
People immediately panic about compliance. How do you then present yourself as a viable investment environment?
It can take 2-3 years to say you know what you're doing.
I'm Rudo Mugwagwa, a cross-border and investment funds lawyer working across governance, structuring, and international investment matters. I'm currently in Zimbabwe, meeting people, talking about what's going on in Zimbabwe and the markets here. I'm joined with Peggy Mapondera, investment principal at Masawara, and she is a non-executive director at Zimnat Asset Management. And she works with Mangwana Opportunities Fund as a non-executive director. She has 15 years of experience across private equity, structured finance, M&A, all across Africa. So today we just wanted to have a discussion around the governance structures, the operational credibility that are considered by investors. So that side of the conversations that maybe people don't have as much view of, especially when you're looking at the Zim perspective. So Peggy, tell us a bit about your experience so we can, give a bit of background context to our discussion.
Thanks, Rudo. Pleasure to be here on this podcast. And I think it's great that you're having these conversations. As you said, I'm an investment principal with Masawara, which is a Pan-African investment holding group. I think you mentioned we're in 10 markets in Africa, and we have a multi-sector portfolio that spans primarily financial services, so specifically insurance, reinsurance, but also asset management and microfinance. We're also into hospitality. In Zim, we operate one of the leading hospitality groups, and in Botswana, we are the largest hotel operator. And we also have an internet service provider with a presence here in Zim, but also in Botswana, Namibia, and Malawi. And then we have sort of some exposure to agro-processing, agrochemicals. And as you also mentioned, I'm also a director for Zimnat Asset Management and the Mangwana Opportunities Fund. So what's interesting about that combination for me is that I see governance from both the operator's lens, but also from an oversight perspective. Yeah, so that's a bit about me. In my spare time or on the side, sort of unofficially, I'm also quite active in the Zim art space. I'm building an art collection, private art collection called the Mapondera Collection. And it just is sort of a passion of mine. I think it brings together creativity, but also aspects of capital and investment and our own identity. So that's something I really enjoy. And I'm also really passionate about investment readiness for early stage businesses. So yeah, I sort of work in that space it's early stages, but in sort of investment initiatives and seeing how to get more capital or more thinking in that space. Yeah.
Yeah, so your experience is actually quite well aligned with the conversation today, but also the greater conversation about, the African private capital ecosystem. There's a lot of sector diversity, especially across, infrastructure, fintech, energy, and financial services in general. Of course, Zimbabwe is a smaller jurisdiction, but when you compare it to the giants, South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, and Egypt, who obviously sort of dominate when it comes to private capital. Right now, the conversations globally around investments, people have been talking about how investors are looking a lot and concentrating a lot of the capital around experienced fund managers. Allocators are prioritizing operational credibility and governance. And a large part of this conversation came from our own conversations offline about the changes we're seeing, right? What's happening globally with the liquidity challenges, but also just the evolution of how capital is being built, right? Considering things like secondaries, but then looking closer and seeing what's going on in Zim, and still that space is still developing. So one of the things we talked about was investor confidence, right? People, again, always, talk about the underlying investment and returns.
Yeah.
And then they sort of shy away. Well, not necessarily shy away, but they don't spotlight as much a lot of the practical sides that's there in terms of what investors consider. For me as a lawyer, we're obviously on the side where it's, obviously you're looking at the very practical considerations. And those include obviously governance issues, the legal structures, sort of any risks that are involved as we advise clients. But from your perspective, I guess, what do you think investors are actually evaluating in the early stages in this market, or more broadly as well, Africa, from your experience?
Yeah. As you said, people overly emphasize returns. And I think returns are, of course, just your baseline to say, obviously, we're not having a conversation if the returns or the numbers don't make sense. But aside from that, from what I've seen, especially being a lot on the sell side, so definitely having to package a story, having to package information that investors want, and being able to communicate that and get deals across the line. What I've experienced is that the conviction that investors eventually get comes from a deeper dive on what is actually underpinning these returns or underpinning the story you're telling. So I would broadly say this probably applies across the board, and then more specifically Africa or Zimbabwe, is people. So they want to understand who are the operators, what's their experience, what are the combination of skills or expertise that come together that make this work and make the story you're telling believable, what's their track record, et cetera, right? And then comes in the processes, which is really how you demonstrate the operations, like that operational rigor, and saying, how are decisions made? Is there an investment committee? Is there a board structure? Are there ways in which issues are escalated? Is there oversight from, people who are involved in the operations, but also independent people who can bring a different perspective? It's also about how what do you have in place to document, get the information that an investor needs to see on an ongoing basis with that transparency. And then I think the third thing then is systems. So I think this comes up a lot more in terms of, sort of this tech evolution. How are you integrating systems into your operations that allow for data collection, analytics, reporting, monitoring, record keeping, and so on, because those systems are what then create transparency that allows you to now be able to put information together, support any claims you're making with real data, real facts and information, and give investors that confidence to say, if things go wrong, I understand exactly how I might be protected. I understand exactly what information I can get and be confident about, the how verifiable that information is. So I think those three things, people, processes, and systems, is broadly sort of the largest thing. And then sort of in the Zimbabwean context, there's sort of an overlay of just our operating environment, which we have a lot of sort of unprecedented events that take place or dynamics that we face that a lot of, especially outside investors, wouldn't necessarily understand or wouldn't necessarily have ever experienced in their markets. So I think, especially for Zimbabwean, be it operators, fund managers, whatever, there is a need to be a little bit better on visibility and transparent. I wouldn't necessarily say that it's not transparent. I'd say more visibility, because tends to be sort of an if you know kind of situation that happens. It's sort of like people in the environment, we know certain dynamics and how to navigate them, but it's hard to explain that to somebody who's outside of that. Some of the information is just not easy to find. You have to be in the know, so to speak, which is very difficult for anybody to then, be able to sort of take the leap and a leap of faith when you're now trying to sell them on what you're trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, you touched on a lot of good things, when you now put it into the context of Zimbabwe. I think you're right. The confidence of investors really revolves around monitoring, verifying, being able to verify, and then obviously the governance structure you have around the entities and the investments, right? Because I think in the end, what they want to know is, can this manager or platform actually run institutional capital responsibly,
exactly.
right?
Yes.
We love to throw around the word, governance, right? But sometimes, people go, okay, what does it really encapsulate?
Yeah.
And I always go to, as a director, of course, you're always going to care about what governance is and what it means. But like you rightly said, governance to me looks at, is there a clear decision-making structure? Is there effective oversight, in this entity or across the firm, the fund, and even lower, right? When you're looking at portfolio companies, right? Because ultimately managers will have to account for what's happening and report on what's happening, right?
Yeah.
And then the transparency around reporting, which you touched on by saying, visibility, because there's visibility at multiple levels. And then also just the discipline around it. You can have all these systems, you can have policies,
Absolutely.
but are your teams actually following? And are you also checking? Are we audit ready, right? And I think that's, when you're talking about governance, there's so many things, but I think to me, that's what it is. For you, absolutely. I think it's the same.
Yeah.
But for you as a non-executive director, where do you think your value comes from? When looking at this governance, this idea of governance, and, how it's said all over, but in Zimbabwe, what does it mean when you are a non-executive director? What is the value you bring?
Yeah. I think the value really is in, yes, the oversight, but also the support. Having the perspective from your expertise or your experience that augments the management capacity and also augments the different skills and expertise that other directors bring. And it's not just a title or just, a box ticking exercise where you go to meetings, hear what management have to say and, just cross it off the list. It's quite a significant responsibility. You're really there to steward the decisions that are being made by the organization. You're also there to sort of, with that independence, that separation, without this sort of emotional attachment that ensures that you're protecting the interests of the people that you represent, especially on an institutional level. If you are representing, an institution that perhaps is managing people's pensions, there's a lot at stake that means the responsibility is quite significant. Sort of setting the expectations and the standards for how an organization or a fund or whatever it may be reports, how they maintain that consistency, and also ensuring that, we don't necessarily expect everything to go right, all the time. Things do go wrong. And it's sort of, how do you approach those challenges? What do you do when things go wrong? How forthcoming management teams, for example, with communicating and then, coming up with the solutions that can carry this forward and mitigate against some of the challenges that you have. And I think it's also having an eye for the risks that may arise. So, you don't want to be overly sort of optimistic in a sense that can end up being reckless. It's about sort of being grounded in, the facts and what is really taking place, looking at it objectively, identifying risks and seeing how they can be mitigated before they really arise.
So sort of preempting some of these risks.
Exactly.
Like you said, obviously in Zimbabwe, there's been a lot of things that have happened, like you said, that are unprecedented. There's different pools of capital that, are available out there. We know that in Africa, there's a lot of private credit. And, looking in Zimbabwe, we know we have low visibility of the, managers have low visibility of what's going on in Zimbabwe in terms of, should we invest there or should we not? And I think one of the big things around this is how do you then present yourself, right, to the outside world as a viable investment environment, right, when you are still developing, right? As a market in Zimbabwe, we are still building our investment, our investment spaces. The activity is there, we know. The underlying opportunities are there. we know.
Yeah.
But it's these things that we're talking about, right? Like the operational credibility, the governance structure, being transparent about, what's happening on the ground, how we're reporting, how we're doing, all these systems that we're discussing. And then having to understand that the current market, liquidity is a thing. So exits matter.
Yes.
Right? Returns matter.
Yeah.
People want to see their money grow and come back. Depending on the type of capital it is, they will have a different expectation, right? If they're putting money in for a longer period of time, maybe it's infrastructure, especially with institutional investors. They have a certain expectation, they're not expecting immediate return, of course, but they expect to have really strong reporting coming through, consistent standards, basically, right? Especially when it comes to compliance. And I think, coming from markets where, the compliance is very heavy, whether it's, you're looking at the offshore jurisdictions and the standards they uphold, Cayman Islands, BVI, and then onshore, when you're looking at London and the US, you see that people have a really high demand for transparency and reporting because they have to also meet these compliance standards, right? And for us, we're maturing in that area. Right? We're still trying to set the foundation to be able to do those things, but we need the capital, right? So from your view, I guess, when you're looking at outside markets, what are some of the things that you see could help in terms of getting us ready, or getting, smaller fund managers in Zimbabwe who are trying to come out, start establishing their track record? What are some of the things that you think they could be doing to try and signal that they can meet these compliance requirements, even though it does seem very burdensome to a really small team? Of course, we know there's due diligence questionnaires that really can tell a really strong story about what investors are looking for, right? And that can obviously guide a lot of upcoming fund managers in what they need to be ready to provide. But what are some of the things you see, and what do you try and do, I guess, your teams, and in your experience, what you've seen in the region?
It's often maybe underestimated how much it takes to get to that level where you can start raising capital offshore, outside of Zimbabwe, whatever it may be. And just for, it can take 2-3 years to build enough of a track record and enough of your sort of reporting standards, systems, processes, all of that can give somebody the actual confidence to say, you know what you're doing. I think it's key, first of all, to understand what is expected. And I guess that can be quite tricky if you don't have a lot of exposure to that. I do feel a lot of entities in Zimbabwe are quite Zimbabwe focused, and we're only sort of just starting to think a bit more broadly, sort of regionally and so on. So it's not underestimating exactly what it takes. I think it's also understanding the aspect of building relationships, that takes a really long time, because people need to know and understand who you are, what your expertise is, what you can do, and so on. And like you were saying, in terms of building that track record, how do you start going about that? And I would say maybe just starting even regionally, co-investment mandates with funds in other countries, or participating on whatever scale that you can. If you've sort of mastered Zimbabwe and you've raised some capital and you've deployed it, and you've, gotten some sort of track record of returns and so on, if you're able to then pull some capital to then co-invest in something, maybe regionally with other funds or other investors, DFIs, whatever it may be, that also raises the credibility, raises your visibility, increases your exposure as well to perhaps more sophisticated structures, or the expectations or the standards that investors have in other markets. I think also in terms of the expertise you need to bring in is very, very important, be it from someone who has that legal and compliance expertise. I think we're quite fortunate in that we have a huge diaspora of Zimbabweans. So attracting the talent, I don't think would be a problem if you have the right sort of vision for what you're building or creating. I think you can then get sort of some of those skills and bring them back home to help you sort of build something that is of an international standard that will meet the requirements that investors have when it comes to due diligence, when it comes to marketing yourself, your credibility, track record, etc., etc. Yeah.
Yeah, you make a really good point, right? You know, a lot of people talk about Zimbabwe having brain drain, but, you know, which is, you know, has its downside. But I think you're right. There's a lot of diasporans who are out there who can actually really contribute that know-how, right?
Exactly.
One of the reasons, you know, I'm here is because I'm principal at Fresh Legal Perspectives. And one of our big things is how do we take that global experience we have working across multiple jurisdictions and work locally with the talent that's already here. There's tons of lawyers who are here. And how do we then work together to be able to advise our clients who maybe are trying to look for investors outside of Zimbabwe, right? They're looking for that capital in markets that they are unfamiliar with. And we have the ability to bring that know-how in. I think collaboration is really underestimated in the investment world. You know, having now worked in different jurisdictions, you know, from Cayman, London to the US, Canada, I've seen how in, you know, especially in the investment funds world, how collaboration is how a lot of these markets have developed, right? Service providers from all over maintaining those connections, whether it's fund administrators, accountants, lawyers from other jurisdictions, you know, executing a lot of these transactions that happen, whether it's M&A, whether it's a portfolio sale. It takes so much collaboration. And the more you can understand other jurisdictions, you can, you know, develop in your own markets. And I think there's obviously a hesitation with going out because people immediately panic about compliance. You know, a lot of the conversations I've had here in Australia as well have been so centered around legal structuring. You know, people deeply concerned about tax consequences, you know, concerned about, I don't know, which is the right jurisdiction. Do I go to Seychelles? Do I go to PVI? You know, and it's funny because, you know, that's one piece. That piece you can solve by understanding all the other things going around, right? Like the border governance issues, the operational frameworks around it. All these things matter, right? And I think having conversations like this, having more people in the industry locally, having these conversations out there, you know, having events, having conversations with each other can demystify a lot of the panic around the legal structures, the tax consequences. Of course, everyone worries about tax. It's not just in emerging markets. It's everywhere. And of course, it drives a lot of the structuring, right? What will be the tax consequences for these, for the investors? And it's a thing they spend a lot of money to get done. And, you know, sometimes for smaller fund managers, it's hard, right? It's difficult to put all that money in, but it's worth it because then the conversations become easier. If you do that legwork, invest in having those conversations with professionals, whether it's accountants, lawyers, it makes conversations later with potential LPs so much easier. And it's that kind of, you know, practical know-how that I think needs to be out there more. And I'm sure you see it as well with portfolio companies. How ready are they to receive whatever capital is deployed to them, right? And, you know, one of the things, you know, as an off counsel as well to Basswood Counsel and Mugwagwa Law, a lot of what we do is actually just being able to have frank conversations with clients who are trying to do these transactions across borders, but can't figure out how to deal with the multiple questions coming their way at the due diligence, you know, in these conversations you're trying to have with potential investors. And I think what's come out of it is that when you are trying to build confidence about your market, having clarity internally about how you're running matters a lot.
It's key.
Because it then becomes difficult, right? If we come in and say, you should have this structure, but you actually only have one director, but the law says you need to have two. If you have an institutional investor you're trying to court, they're going to say, okay, what is the business continuity plan you have in place? Who's going to be doing these reports that we need to do every quarter? Who's the person here in your team, right? So yeah, that's, I guess, one of the things. Like for you, what are some of the things you look for when you're building your team, right? Or when you're working or collaborating with other service providers, right? Like you've rightly said, you have to pick your team well. But what are some of the things that you guys tend to, I guess, highlight or focus on as, with the entities that you work with? What are some of the things that you really highlight to the service providers to make sure they're really delivering, what you need in order to be able to go out there?
Yeah, I think it's really key. So sort of in-house, being an investment holding group, in-house, of course, we have the investments and legals team, which is sort of really, really crucial. We work very closely together because with investments, we probably have more of the commercial side to say, this is what we're trying to achieve commercially. And we need the legal team to be able to translate that into legals, be it the agreements, the protections in those agreements, et cetera, et cetera. But then you also have, like you said, the tax consideration. So on the finance side, you need that expertise. And for us, we have that in-house because of the nature of the organization that we are. Where it might be an operating company, you then look for service providers that can provide these services as a baseline. But even though we have these services in-house, we do still have third-party service providers, especially in different markets that we're in, because the regulatory considerations and tax considerations that are just very different from what, sort of our in-house team might have, for example, especially if it's a new market that we're going into. So we do tend to look for reputation. That's really, really important because, you don't want to do perhaps evaluation, for example, of an opportunity or of your company or whatever, take it to an investor and they have no idea, the track record, credentials, the name of the firm that carried out that valuation. And they're not going to want to rely on that, for example. So reputation is quite a big one. But even when we go with the reputable firms, in the teams that they propose, we'll be working on a particular transaction or mandate. What is their specific experience? Like, have they actually done, these types of transactions? How familiar are they with the uniqueness of a Zimbabwean entity or a Zimbabwean entity that might have holding structures in different jurisdictions that have different considerations, be it, Mauritius, be it Jersey, these kinds of jurisdictions. And it's not even uniquely sort of a Zimbabwean issue. I mean, we might deal with service providers in South Africa and Botswana and so on, and we still ask them these particular questions. And from what I said before, there are very, very unique dynamics in Zimbabwe that even professionals in those markets that we might consider to be more advanced have not had exposure to. They don't have necessarily that expertise or that skill set or whatever. So that's a very important piece of it, and ensuring that they understand our expectations in terms of what needs to be delivered, how they need to go about it, and what the outcome needs to be. Like being very, very clear with that. What you can have in-house, be very rigorous with the skills you're bringing in, and then be very, very deliberate about the service providers that you then bring on to support. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Yeah, I mean, you've hit all the key things that we normally hear people talking about, right? When you're going out in the market and you speak to institutional investors, they will always vet the team that you have. And sometimes it's not necessarily always about the size of the team, but how the type of work they've done.
Exactly.
There's a lot of very niche things that happen. Like you said, in Zimbabwe, we've had some unique things play out in terms economically. We have some unique opportunities as well. Yeah. Well, I guess in emerging markets in general, that's what makes them so fun, right? Yeah. There's all these underlying opportunities that can be so unique. And how do you get the outside community, the diaspora, to feel comfortable, right, with all these things that are so unique or happening in very limited scenarios, right? The good news is we know that, in Africa, I think it was the African Private Capital Association, I think they had a report out where they highlighted that African LPs investment is up, 25%. And in previous years, it was, 18%, something like that. And so obviously it means that, we are getting flows, and sometimes it's looking within, right? And through ourselves, because we understand our economies better sometimes, because we face similar experiences, right? Because obviously the economic blocks are there, and we're, Africa's filled with emerging economies, right? So there's a viability there, right?
Yeah.
We have the ability to maneuver certain risks that outsiders are not used to. Yeah. And so, I hope obviously over time that we do continue to put money in, as, African LPs continue to look within and look to how, because that will build the overall confidence in the region, in the various economic blocks, whether it's SADC, whether it's ECOWAS, and hopefully that then pushes that visibility issue further back. Yeah. And it also helps develop the systems, right? To develop our own governance structures, our own legal environments, right? The regulation around it. Because of course, there is some catch up we have, right? We know that, for example, in Zim, now we're looking to exchange more tax information, right? And when you're looking at the time horizon to be able to do that, there's a lot of steps before we're able to. But we know many countries, already, common reporting standard. We know America has US FACA that allows them to exchange, people to exchange information with the IRS. And we still need to get to that point. Yeah. So I think the catch up that some economies need within the continent, that comes from us having confidence within our markets. 100%. And I think for you, obviously having had that experience, over 15 years, I think, it's good to find professionals like you who can actually speak to how we do, right? When we invest in, and how that can actually open doors to outside markets. Now, that's not to say we should always be looking outside, right? For investments. But one of the things that I love about Zim is the conversations around Diaspora and the micro investing they're doing in Zimbabwe. Yes. I think that's one of the most exciting things, maybe we're biased because we're from here. But it's so many conversations of people pooling, their small amounts of capital and investing, whether it's small solar projects, whether it's agribusinesses. And I think it's all about how do we get all of that to help us build more momentum to get more, right? Yeah. But from your view, what's your thing that you're excited about when you're seeing this activity in Zim and how people can actually organize more to sort of scale up from doing this micro, friends and family thing we love doing in Zim. It's smart, but we can do more.
Yeah. I think the desire is there. I think people recognize and understand that there's so much opportunity. And I think it's now going to take the people who can sort of organize that into things that are more institutional, like you're saying, less of the friends and family, less of the if you know, be in the know type of thing. And I think the opportunity really is there. And it's about matching the capital to the opportunities. Of course, by the nature of how our economy is, we have majority SMEs, small businesses, people who have, been thrown into entrepreneurship, be it for self-employment or but they've really tapped on some really great opportunities that are doing really well. And it's supporting those businesses to say, okay, you're onto something. How do we now get you to become a real institution or a corporate that's not just, personality driven by one entrepreneur, but creating those systems, creating that investment readiness, creating strategies around growth and scaling, regionalization. You mentioned before, there needs to be exits, right? Building businesses to sell in the future. That's such a big thing. If I get on a soapbox, that's my thing. People need to build businesses to sell. I think it's supporting those entrepreneurs, those small businesses. That's really important. You see some activity with corporate entities starting sort of incubator hubs and that sort of thing, trying to provide support and training. But I think a lot more work needs to be done in that space. And then it's then matching the investors to say, okay, now that we have credibility and investable businesses, a pipeline of them, how now do we give you the confidence to be able to put your money into these opportunities? What are the vehicles? What are the structures that are put in place, creating either funds or whatever it is that somebody can be assured, if I give you my money for investment, this is what you can assure me. These are the parameters we're working with. These are the structures in place to protect all parties, the investor, the business person, and the fund manager or the intermediary in between. And I think that will really allow us to grow a bigger ecosystem. Our capital markets in Zimbabwe domestically are very small, and we're just going to need that outside capital. And I think it's best, like you're saying, to come from the people who actually understand the dynamics, who believe in the future of the country and what it can be. We need to sort of support ourselves. And with a lot of what you see, even in other economies and sectors, that local buy-in or that buy-in from the people themselves gives other investors or external, investors, foreign investors, the confidence, because we have affirmed the value ourselves. We are doing the investing ourselves. We are getting the success stories. They might start off at a small scale, but that's proof of concept. So now when you go to an international organization, an international fund, etc., you have some track record, some success stories. You now have systems in place where you can say there's visibility, there's reporting, there are standards in place, and, sort of the good governance is in place. The standard sort of operating level has been elevated somewhat, and that can give them the confidence. So I think that diaspora community
is key.
I think is key. I think the desire is there. It's now just organizing it into structures that make sense for everybody.
Yeah, I mean, you touched on so many good things, and I hope people are listening. But one truth, that we obviously always have to face is exits and people making money.
Yeah.
Obviously globally, we know that, times are a bit tough.
Yeah.
We know that, liquidity has been a conversation now for the past 2-3 years. I was fortunate actually, when I was in London, I had the opportunity to work with a team that was really already honing in on secondaries and advising clients a lot on secondaries, and whether it was GP-leds, whether it was continuation vehicles. And honestly, I'm just longing for that day where we actually have, our market has matured enough to be able to now start accessing some of those pathways, right? Some of those exit opportunities or some of these things around liquidity. Of course, in Zim, because of, other policy measures we have the challenge of having to answer, right? About how do I get my money out? And also the need for us to have longer, exactly. Unfortunately, I don't think we are quite ready yet to be doing a lot of those kind of transactions, whether it's preferred equity, NAV financing. I don't think we have enough yet in terms of our own development to use those, in high volume yet, right? Yeah. But I think we can see that, we are maturing, hopefully having conversations like this, especially from the people who are on the ground, who are here trying to make the market mature, right? Whether it's directors like you, investment firms, there's so many people that I met that are trying to start really interesting projects here. And hopefully we can support, right? The Diaspora can come and support, whether it's through know-how or whether it's through actually, taking that risk of putting some of their money back into the market here. Those things hopefully will help, right? Help reinforce that idea of we need to have visibility of the market. Yeah. We need to have transparency. We need to have that operational credibility piece. in order for us to be able to fully experience the benefits of, the global market. But yeah, before we wrap up, obviously, Peggy and I are very much passionate about young women coming into finance world. Of course, I'm also biased because I also obviously then care about them coming into the legal space, on that side of it, the corporate finance side of it. And I know Peggy has some interesting projects you want to share.
So I think for me, the main project is an investment initiative called Athera Capital. So within that space, it's just trying to, like you're saying, demystifying through some of these conversations, capacity building, trainings, whatever it may be, thought leadership or sharing insights on what it takes to be investment ready. I think that's really, really critical. What it takes to be an investment professional in this space. I think in this market, there was a time when we sort of had that economic issue where a lot of the more sophisticated financial transactions just sort of came to a standstill, and we went back to very sort of vanilla banking, just plain good old lending and whatnot, and that still is quite prevalent. So there was a little bit of a skills gap in that space for people who had done M&A, real investment banking type of experience, corporate finance, and so on. But it's slowly coming back. But as a woman in this space, definitely very male dominated, and it would be great to see more women come into these spaces. But it's slowly starting to happen like in that way. The second part is, especially on the investment readiness, working with women-owned, women-led businesses. My particular interest is in agribusiness, and just trying to provide support to entrepreneurs in that field who have the potential to really scale their businesses, supporting them along their journey. And, eventually I would love for that to develop into sort of, a real investment vehicle, investment fund that can support these kinds of businesses in that space. So yeah, it's still early days, but that's something that I'm really, really passionate about, and really would love to connect with people who have an interest in that area. And like you're saying, it's all about having more and more of these conversations, creating platforms, collaboration to advance in these areas.
No, we are. I think Peggy and I get on our soapbox about women being in the financial industry. I mean, there's so many organizations out there that are obviously, they obviously have the same goal. Like 100 Women in Finance is one of those that, if you're out there and you're a young lady trying to, grow in the investment world, that's definitely an organization that I also benefited from. On my end, we have NVH Partners, and with NVH Partners, that's what we really, one of the many things we focus on is how do we get people to be investor ready, and helping people try and build that capital, right? And agribusiness is obviously one of the big areas that women are really stepping into. So Peggy and I will probably have more conversations to keep talking about all these things, but there's only but so much time. We hope everyone's, able to take something away from the conversation, especially people who don't get to hear what's going on in Zimbabwe. Of course, we just literally scratch the surface to give just a peek into the investment landscape here. But we hope that more conversations come. And when they do, hopefully some of them will share with you, and hopefully others will choose to do the same. To all the young people, Peggy and I went to the same school in primary school. That primary school should get a shout out. Bishopsley, thank you.
20-something years later.
I never underestimate the power of your network. And I think that's probably one, if you're taking away anything as a young person, never underestimate the power of your network in helping you navigate a new terrain, or to, dig deeper into whatever you specialize in, even if it's not finance. Till next time.
Thank you so much.